Greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining us for what is maybe, I want to be careful with hyperbole, one of the most important conversations we can have as a people because it is about race and money. Our panel discussion is money in color, and it's a conversation that needs to be had. It's a conversation that's had sometimes, but it's not fulsome, it's not comprehensive. And you'll see from the research that we're going to present, it also prevents many communities and people of color from participating in, benefiting from, and growing in the financial prosperity that many others routinely appreciate. And it quite frankly keeps the nation from enjoying the contribution of many groups who want to be a part but have not been able to. So I'm going to start with some research, but my colleague from Cheddar, Brad Smith, is going to do a beautiful introduction of the other panelists. And when I came in, they were talking about whales and whale watching. So I know that they know money, but they also appear to be incredibly interesting people. So we'll possibly get to that at the end. All right, let's get to the data, and then we'll have a really robust conversation. So first, a little bit about the Edelman Trust Barometer. This is something that we have been doing for 21 years. And we look at the level of trust in the four primary institutions that make up a civil society: media, government, business, and nonprofits. Next slide, please, Emily. And for years, we have talked about the fact that the financial services institutions have a trust issue. This is not something that's new in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. We've had so many conversations about where systemic racism exists, where we are making progress. But unfortunately for the financial services institutions, this is a decade in the making. Financial services rank last in addressing racism. Hopefully you are aware, listeners and audience members, of not only the Trust Barometer work that we've been doing, but the very specific conversations and research that we have commissioned on race, the impact of racism, the role and responsibility of business, the role and responsibility of brands. And when we asked this question, we said, who's doing well? And if you look at the bottom, financial services, and again, this is a decade in the making, but it was reinforced in this most recent research that we did. Next slide. Historical context. Forgive me for using my glasses here. Generations of economic deprivation. You heard me talk about this before. GDP loss in the U.S. economy due to discrimination since 2000, 16 trillion. Barriers to wealth creation, 26%. Latinx families least likely to own retirement accounts among all Americans. Impact on wealth transfer. The wealth of a typical white family in comparison to Black families is pretty remarkable. And then when you look at all of these contexts and you put them together, it's a picture that is best described as frustrating because the potential for greatness and the potential for wealth creation, wealth sharing, and wealth contribution is remarkable. Next slide, please. So we wanted to go deeper and to really pinpoint the barriers to wealth accumulation, and not with the intent of raising the questions, which is really important, but what are the tangible solutions? What are the things very specifically that we can be doing to ensure that wealth is accumulated and wealth is shared and wealth is passed along? And quite frankly, we did this for our clients because we represent many financial institutions who were saying to us, look, I want to be a part of the solution. Tell me what I can be doing and where I can be contributing to make this a more fulsome conversation and to make sure that we are accessing the resources and the potential of everyone in our system. Next slide. So 4 key takeaways for this research that we did in August of 2021. And for those of you who have been following these issues, there's no big surprises, except the biggest surprise is that we're still having the conversation. 1, acknowledgement of bias in the financial system is widespread across all subsectors, but particularly among Black Americans, and I'll go into that with more detail. 2, communities of color And this is important regardless of their financial situations, their personal financial situations, talk about systemic bias when they interact with the financial system. In fact, and I'll talk more about this, it's actually worse for high income earners. 3, absent fair treatment from the financial system, people of color turn to alternative solutions. This is something that we've seen throughout history, but the fact that we are still doing this and the travesty of the impact that it has is troubling. 4, for Americans of color, the impact is palpable, and they see their financial goals as less attainable than their white counterparts. Many of you hear everyone say, if you can see it, you can be it. It's the same thing here. If you see that people that look like you are making money, you believe that you can make money. And the more money you make and the more money you put into the system and get out of the system, the better it is for everyone. All right, let's talk about these a little bit more specifically. So 1, acknowledgement of bias in the financial system is widespread across all subsectors. Next slide. Perceived systemic bias and discrimination across subsectors, particularly among Black people. And you'll hear me say this a lot because this is what the data supported, that yes, all communities of color are affected by this, but it is particularly intense among African Americans, Black people. In response to the question, I think there is systemic bias and discrimination towards certain groups of people within companies in this industry. And this is across the board. And this is because sometimes it's easy to say, well, it's just here, it's just here, it's just here. It's everywhere that it matters. It's in banks, it's in auto lending, it's in mortgage lending, it's in credit card companies, it's in insurance companies. So across the board, this bias exists. And we'll talk about solutions at the end, but it is very important that we recognize the severity and the comprehensiveness of the problem. Next slide. Communities of color firmly reported systemic bias regardless of their financial situations. Many of you who have been in this conversation before know we always say, so is it race or is it color? Next slide. Is it race or is it class? You know, we get comfortable saying, well, no, it's just that class of people. No, straight up. It is across the board for communities of color, and it is particularly for people who are in a higher income bracket. And how do those things show up? We talked about it here, list of negative experiences. An employee talked down to me. People didn't care to get to know me as a person. I felt the need to change my appearance when interacting. For those of us who have been in this space for a while, we've heard our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents talk about how they felt when they had to talk to the banker. They had to look a certain way. I see Camilla nodding because this is something that we experience and something that we talk about. But in 2021, people still feeling that they have to look a certain way regardless of their income to be respected. I felt ignored or not seen at a physical location. You come in and you have money. You know, we always talk about like a good paycheck and wealth. And I'm talking about people who actually have wealth who are treated this way because there's an automatic perception that because you are a particular color, you could not be making this type of money. And then it's questioned repeatedly and repeatedly. So like rooted issues, again, there are solutions, but rooted issues here. Next slide, please. Absent fair treatment from the financial system, people of color turn to alternative solutions. This to me is the travesty of it. Next slide. We know that communities of color know how to make money. We know, in particular, Black people know how to make money. The first female millionaire in this country was a Black woman, Madam C.J. Walker. So this money has been, this wealth creation has been in the system for a very, very long time. But, you know, when I don't feel that I'm respected, what do I do with that? I switch financial services. So financial services, you lose because you don't get my business anymore. I start using financial services company less. I save my money at home. This is an awkward acknowledgement, but honestly, there are a lot of people who still put their money under the mattress. Or there was a case in Chicago, a woman who had put her money in the freezer. And why do people do that? Because they don't have confidence that their money is going to be treated well, respected, or grown when they go to financial institutions. And then I use alternative investment tools like cryptocurrency to avoid dealing with financial services companies. payday loans, retail stores, et cetera. So the travesty here is not only are communities of color having a negative impact, but these institutions, the money's not going into the institutions, and therefore the money is not being used appropriately and properly. Next slide. For Americans of color, the impact is palpable. I, for one, am grateful of the increased attention that all of us are paying to mental health and the impact that it has on how we live our lives and the decisions that we make. Next slide, please. When we talk about what the actual impact is, many financial goals are seen far less attainable for Black and Latinx communities. The percent of people who feel that their financial goals are not attainable, if you look at the numbers here, but and I don't think we have this data point, but the one that really stood out the most with me was in Latinx communities who said, it makes me so uncomfortable to talk about money. I actually feel physically ill. I get so uncomfortable about my ability when I know my potential is strong, it has an impact on my mental health. And so these issues are material, and they are also spiritual, and they are also psychological. But there is a path forward. I'm a firm believer that everything can be resolved, and these solutions are obvious and they're doable. And then my fellow colleagues will talk about what do we do here. So one, again, build representation into the workforce so that when you walk into and when you have an experience, when you see someone that looks like you, that you believe understands and respects you, you just start to relax. So representation into the workforce. Increasingly, we don't use the words DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. This is about representation and making sure that our workforces are, our communities, our workplaces are representative of the actual numbers that the Census Department just talked about. Two, training. We've had so much conversation about unconscious bias and conscious bias. Train people so that if they are unconsciously executing bias, teach them how to take it out. And as importantly, when you see something, say something. So among colleagues, when you see someone not being respected, say something about it and make sure that there are repercussions. Four, reevaluate risk assessments. So you've got risk assessments that were based on an old model of people who had power and wealth. This new world order is very different. So we need to evaluate risk assessments that are consistent with the way we are operating now. And then four, I mean, this could be the solution for everything, right? Create inclusive, welcoming environments. Make sure that people feel that they are valued, that they are respected, and that they have a seat at the table. I think, Brad, over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Lisa, and I'm so glad to join this amazing panel today. And good morning, good afternoon, good day to our guests, viewers, listeners from wherever you're joining us from. My name is Brad Smith. I'm an anchor at Cheddar News for our show Opening Bell, live from the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. I also co-host our weekly specials, All Hands, Race Toward Inclusion, and Search for a Cure COVID-19 as well. And I have the great honor of being your moderator for today's panel discussion. So to paraphrase musical poet Jay-Z, you could have been anywhere in the world, but you decided to be here with us, and we appreciate that. And I've been particularly excited about the work that Edelman has been doing that yielded the insights, the conclusions that Lisa just ran through and so eloquently delivered as well, and the conclusions that were published in the Money in Color study. This put measurement around the financial inequities that are felt by multicultural consumers. And I think I speak on behalf of our panelists when I say thank you for joining us today to candidly discuss some of these solutions that we're going to be working through and being deployed to address the significant and wide-ranging barriers that are seen across sectors. And this conversation, quite frankly, is gonna keep it 2 Curtis Jacksons. So be ready and be engaged. And we've got a few housekeeping items just before I dive into some introductions here. First and foremost, if you have questions, bring them. At 2 points in today's panel discussion, we're going to have audience questions, and we would love to hear from you. And also, spread love. If you hear something that you love from the speakers, let them know in that Q&A section. It's not just for questions, it's also for a little bit of chat as well. And so we would love to get that love spread across to some of our panelists who have taken the time to join us today. And so without any further delay, allow me to introduce our speakers. First and foremost, we have Camilla Elliott, who is the president of Grid 202 Partners, a financial planning firm with locations in Washington, D.C., Georgia, North Carolina as well. She has nearly 2 decades of financial planning and investment experience, assisting in high net worth individuals, endowments and foundations, and business owners with comprehensive wealth solutions and holistic planning. We're going to dive into a little bit more of her career journey in a moment. So we're going to stick a pin in that for a second and come back to Camilla. But Ray Martinez, I got to introduce you to Ray, introduced to some, reintroduced to some others perhaps, the co-founder and president of EverFi. And in this capacity, he leads the company's financial education and conduct and culture business units. Now, EverFi's financial education offerings, they power financial capability programs for hundreds of financial institutions across the country. And under Ray's vision leadership, EverFi's financial capability network has grown to include more than 900 financial institutions, delivering critical personal finance, entrepreneurship, and investment education to K through 12 students and adults in all 50 states, Puerto Rico, and Canada. And so that is Ray Martinez. And of course, you just heard from the one and only Lisa Osborne Ross, serving as Edelman's U.S. Chief Executive Officer. And in this role, Ms. Ross leads the firm's largest region, 13 offices, more than 2,300 employees. And prior to taking the helm as U.S. CEO in May 2021, she served as U.S. Chief Operating Officer and President of Edelman's Washington, D.C. office. She is known as a very in-demand counselor and to senior executives across the Fortune 500, higher education and government institutions. So with that and the introductions of all of the speakers that we have today, let's dive right in. I mentioned that we'd come back to Camilla, so I want to start there. I would love to start with you, Camilla. Tell us about your journey from private wealth management and advisory service capacity that you provided to the ultra high net worth individuals, and then redirecting that sharing of best financial practices to the individuals and households that have historically been underserved and even underbanked as well.
Thank you, Brian. You are correct. I spent over almost 20 years in corporate America, working at large wealth management firms, and obtained my CFP designation. It was really helping them with things of like estate planning, investment allocation, ways to build generational wealth, risk management. And I learned a ton. One of the things that people are surprised by, most of my clients were entrepreneurs or C-suite executives, developers of wealth for their family. But not surprising to you, no one looked like me. I was all across the country. I probably visited over 200 ultra high net worth families. And when I'm saying ultra high net worth, these were clients at a minimum had $20 million invested at our firm, but not one looked like me. And that's when I began to think, what is the right next step? How do I take all of this knowledge? How do I learn how these families, they're having family meetings about how to maintain and continue to grow their wealth. And you and I know, and I know Ray knows this as well, is that doesn't happen in minority households. So how do I take these best practices? So I took very deliberate steps. And in 3 years, I left corporate America. And I joined an all diverse RIA firm. And I decided that one of the things that's really important to me was to not have account minimums, to help underserved families, to help people that are typically closed out of the financial services system, and to take all those learnings and teach from a webinar perspective or one-on-one coaching of how did these ultra high net worth families gain this wealth? What do they talk about in their family meetings? What are the risk measures or what are the risk parameters they had to ensure they're passing that wealth from one generation to another? The biggest barrier is sending it to the third generation. So it's the grandfather, grandmother, the child that watches their parents create that wealth, and usually it's the third generation that loses it. And so it was really helpful for me to see that in action and be able to describe that and teach those really meaningful skills to primarily African-American communities.
Absolutely. And you have some stellar research that we're going to break down as well later on today during our conversation. Ray, I do want to bring you into this as well. Perhaps another great stage setter for the remainder of our conversation. Could you explain further, because one of the topics that's going to continue to be brought up is impact as a service. Plus some of the partners that you work with to create impact-based solutions. Can you break that down for us?
Yeah, absolutely. And Camilla's introduction was really fantastic. I think, one of our learnings over the last 13 years is that these conversations around wealth and money need to start earlier. So how do we influence the dinner table conversations in families across the United States? And so for the last 13 years, Brad, we've built out a really interesting network of over 25,000 public schools here in the United States and in Puerto Rico that use our financial education technology to really meet a lot of the unfunded mandates that have been passed here in the United States. I think eventually you will have all 50 states require some type of instruction in order to graduate from high school, the importance of savings, budgeting, how do you navigate student loans, the importance of your credit score. And there are about 5 million students every year that get certified in this instruction. That platform and those course contents are fully funded by the private sector. So our bank partners white label and provide that solution in the communities that they serve. And I want to break down the numbers a little bit further here because I think it supports this conversation. 43% of the students that are accessing the software during the school day are BIPOC. 41% are low to moderate income students. And so Impact as a service really allows our partners to leverage technology and scale and data and outcomes to really drive this conversation of financial capability, financial literacy, financial well-being, but to start earlier. And a few other things I just want to mention here in the introduction. There's been a lot of emerging academic research, exciting academic research that's come out over the last 20 months that really answers the question, does financial literacy work? Because a lot of people will say, no, it doesn't. These interventions are not effective. Well, the National Bureau of Economic Research just published a paper where they looked at 76 randomized control trials and the causal effects of providing financial education programs to over 160,000 individuals. And the headline is financial education interventions, they work. And they're particularly effective for low to moderate income students and low to moderate income families. The challenge is we've only measured it over a short period of time. So one of the things that we're embarking on is we're going to embark on a 4-year longitudinal study. We're going to start in 8th grade and follow students and families all the way through 12th grade. And we have 350 families that have signed up for this study. But I think it gets back to Lisa's question and comment around how do you not make this a taboo? Like, how do you not make these conversations so uncomfortable? The way that you do that is that you start earlier and that this is a lifelong skill that you need to develop. Just like we teach math and reading and test math and reading at scale, we're going to eventually need to do this. And let's start early. And the particular time to intervene is around 13. So the academic research says that students go through financial socialization at the age of 13. I'm starting to see this with my 12-year-old, where they start developing their norms and their values and their relationship with money. Well, that's a perfect time to begin a financial education, financial capability conversation.
And so on the topic of some of the research, and that was an excellent breakdown of what we've seen both in public data and some of the research that's been done over an extended period of time. Lisa, coming back to you, in addition to the Edelman research that's been done, some of the public data that you alluded to as well on the U.S. Census front, some of that public data that's been captured significantly shifts the solutions that we craft. Notably, the latest figures from the U.S. Census show that multicultural communities, they are the emerging majority. And so talk about the multi-stakeholder approach that is needed and necessary to accelerate intergenerational wealth transfers.
Brad, well, first of all, thank you so much for using the right words. I feel like I have been on a mission for the past 30 years, well, that's obviously an exaggeration, to eliminate the word minority. Communities of color, we are not a minority. And just the concept of minority is less than. It's left over. It's something else. And so, first of all, we have to embrace and better, more accurately define ourselves as, and you said it, Ray, and it was music to my ears, emerging majorities. It's also why I said we don't use the word, we're moving away from diversity, equity, and inclusion. Who am I asking to be included when the majority are people that look like me? And so we are all inviting people to come to the table, but it's a power shift that's different. I think lastly, Brad, to your point, this conversation about cultural competency and comfort around money. Like, it is so critical. Ray, I love that you're talking to your 12-year-old. For all of us who have access to young people or institutions, it is something that should be taught, because communities of color have not historically, not because they haven't had money, we haven't had money, but the comfort level of talking about it, of not making it taboo, is important. And I think it leads to all of those solutions that we talked about. So comfort level with money, comfort level with making money, sharing money, and as Camilla said, passing that money down. That's the key thing, is how do you pass that money down? And God forbid, enjoy the money too. You know,
Certainly.
You're making it, so enjoy it and have fun with it at the same time.
And
We
Lisa,
certainly all enjoy that portion too. Sorry, Ray, you had something else to add
no,
on.
I was just going to say to Lisa's point, we now with technology, I think, have an opportunity to intervene, whether it's in school, at the workplace, through nonprofit organizations. If you're a student that is not coming from a family where money is part of the dinner table conversation, well, you should be able to get that elsewhere, regardless of where you live, regardless of your zip code. And I think that's the promise, Brad, in my mind, of Impact as a Service, is that technology can play a key role in scaling this, and to make sure that every person, every individual has access to this information.
And so let's stay on that topic of technology, because it still feels like within the financial services sector, there is so much acceleration of technology that has yet to be tapped into to better the solutions for anybody across cultures. And so with that in mind, considering the census data that Lisa was breaking down with some of those key takeaways, but also the known perceptions that both you and Camilla have studied, Ray and Camilla have studied, on the front of the relationship between end users and consumers and their financial institutions, and how that is vastly different across ethnic lines. What do you think of some of the efforts by financial institutions over the last year and a half to make commitments to underserved communities, and where could they accelerate some of those efforts, either through technology or through just having more of a conversation with those clients as well? And I'll go to you first, Camilla. I know you've done a lot of studies on this.
Well, one of the things I was really proud of is organizations looking at their policies and seeing who is it affecting intentionally or adversely. So I think a good example is Ally Bank. Ally Bank announced earlier this year they were stopping overdraft fees. They saw that only 1% of their clients were being assessed this fee, but it was overwhelmingly affecting those that were under lower socioeconomic status or that were communities of color. So I think something like that, or organizations continue looking at their policies and seeing, yes, we may be generating incremental revenue from assessing these fees, but think about the disproportionate impact that it's having on communities of color and their ability to gain wealth. And to your point, Bradley, in terms of technology, one of the things I'm seeing, particularly with my colleagues and my friends, is, and it's what Lisa mentioned earlier about what were the barriers to accessing financial services. Part of it was just walking into the office, walking into the bank, walking into the building, and having someone look at you and say, why are you here? Do you deserve to be here? What do you do for a living? And I think the technology and the ability to completely have, 100% interface, user interface online or an app, is a huge, we're removing a huge impediment to accessing financial services, because now there's no judgment, there's no questioning. It's an all digital approach. And I think it encourages people to access the system and be able to create wealth.
And Brad, I'd like to just share two examples here.
Sure.
Number one is, financial services technology is moving so fast, and we can't leave people out of the system. Like we can't do that. And one of the companies that I've seen that's just done a great job with this is Alco, who's the CEO of Early Warning Systems, which is Zelle. And Zelle is the peer-to-peer payment technology system. And so if you're a consumer today, using peer-to-peer payments in a safe way so you avoid scams and frauds, how do you bank in a modern digital age what Al and his team decided to do is, well, let's leverage technology to educate high schools all across the United States and consumers on this topic. And let's measure the impact of providing a program like that. The second one that relates to Lisa's opening comments is representation in the financial services field. I know Maxine Waters has taken a very close look at this at the House Financial Services Committee, but Joe Christine, who is the director of the Principal Foundation, they're launching a really unique initiative, Joe Christine and her team, where they're running a pilot where they want to educate 70,000 students on the data science of financial services. And Camilla, I think you would love this, because what are the skills that you need to have in order to have a career in financial services? Many students don't even know all the different opportunities that exist within a financial institution. And there are some really interesting and phenomenal jobs in the work that can be done in the communities that you care about, in the communities that you come from. And I think it's one of the reasons why I love the work that I do every day is, growing up in a really rural community in Spencer, Massachusetts, coming from a multiracial Latinx family, being the first person in my nuclear family to graduate from college. I was lucky. I mean, I had incredible teachers and parents and a support network. And so I think it's important that we leverage technology to level the playing field and make sure that every student in this country has access to a quality education. And that's going to take the public sector, the private sector, nonprofits working together. And this conversation is so helpful, Lisa, that you're leading.
Absolutely. And I do want to shift the question back to Lisa, just to add on what you were mentioning, Ray, in terms of making sure that people know that there are opportunities in financial services that don't require you to have this massive statistical background or have to be a mathematician. I mean, my job at NASDAQ, when I worked there for 4.5 years, you learn about so many things within the industry without directly having that knowledge set coming in the door. What they're looking for are people who are malleable, who are willing to learn and are excited to learn more about the job and the industry that you touch, while having a skill level and an expertise in the direct role that you will be using to benefit that company or add value to that company as well. And one of my favorite algorithms that I continue to fall into within Instagram is the young women of color who are making sure that they're sharing to the rest of their followers, you do not need all of these things to have a job in tech or this, that, and the third industry. And I think it's so important that our young people today, and those who are even upskilling or retraining to re-enter into the workforce in a new role, that they do understand that and are encouraged by that as well. And speaking of upskilling, training, a lot of that happening within the organization, especially at the time where these commitments are being made by companies to better serve multicultural constituents. And so oftentimes those commitments require training on bias, on engagement, and as they reshape their core values as well. And Lisa, knowing how much you are leaned upon from Fortune 500 institutions and all of the different clients that Edelman has, how have these discussions taken place, and what typically are you seeing as one of the top questions and your own conversation and dialogue that you have with some of these executives too?
It's a great question, Brad, and it's probably the richness of the past 18 months. We've all talked about everything that's all of us as a nation, just as a community, have experienced with COVID, the resurgence of COVID, the Delta variant, all of the natural disasters, and obviously our racial reckoning that is taking place right now. But some of the upsides of that are that CEOs who had tangentially been interested in these things are now asking hard questions. CEOs who knew that they should, but didn't really feel it, are now feeling it. CEOs who are in a position to lead, is some of our research talks about, if you're in a position of leadership, please lead, because then it gives other people the comfort level to follow you. And so we're seeing leaders who are stepping up and this is awkward, but stepping up and calling out. So not only saying, oh, that's great that you're doing that, but hey, you're not, and I'm watching you, and this is not cool. and you're going to have to do that. And then before I leave, I just love this conversation about representation in the physical nature, and these young women who were saying, look, these are the wide array of things that you can do in industry. And in the financial services, this is the wide array because it demystifies it. It demystifies it. It's also not only can you do this, but you can do it being you.
Yes.
You can do it with your locks. You can do it with your piercings. You can do it with your tats. You can do it, but just bringing your authentic self to the workplace, because then very often you see people who are like, and you're like, okay, that person has the same skin color, but seriously, we have nothing in common. And that's discouraging. But then when you see somebody that looks like you in the wide array of how we show up, I think that is the real change that's taking place. And it demystifies money, it demystifies operating in the financial services system, and it makes all of us 10 times better.
Yeah, and I think get Camilla.
Because one thing I want to mention is, I'm also I'll be the chair for the CFP board next year, which is 90,000 CFP professionals, the first African-American female and the youngest person ever to serve in that role. And I say that to Lisa's point. I mean, to be it, you have to see it. And I can't even tell you, as soon as that announcement came in, I was flooded with LinkedIn requests, emails. You have to your point, you have your natural hair. Like, yes, it's been curly for several years, right? Like, when did you do that? Did you feel comfortable being yourself? And, asking about my clients, and to your point, Bradley, as a financial planner and working with over about 65 households right now, I am myself. We talk about Jay-Z, we talk about movies, and thinking about, most of my client conversations are not about their investment portfolio, right? My conversations are about their goals, are about their family, what's most important to you, and how can I help you reach your personal goals through financial assets. And so it's really important we deliver that message of, it's such a great, rewarding career. You can be your authentic self, and you can work with people that, look like you and that you want to see succeed. So kudos to all of you, really encouraging that message. But I think that's one thing to think about is when we're trying to find ways to promote this profession, who are we putting out there to represent it is equally as important.
Absolutely. Ray, I believe you wanted to add something on.
Well, I was just going to say, Camilla should be known by millions of students across this country, young men and young women who are thinking about their careers. And that is the promise of technology. And just like they should know Camilla, they should know what Bina Elliott is doing at JP Morgan Chase. They should know that the Sunda Duckett, what she is doing at TIAA, Darlene Gones at Wells Fargo, Joseph Hernandez at TIAA. There are incredibly diverse leaders in this country that are doing incredible, incredible things on this topic. And we need to spread that message more.
Absolutely. As we're kind of approaching the end of our planned questions here, I just do want to remind at this kind of like halfway point for our viewers that you can insert questions into the Q&A section, and we do have some time allotted towards the end. I would love to make sure that we get to your questions. Prior to that, I do want to come back to this idea, because there is this there's a sub theme that and sub message that I believe you hit on there, Camilla, a moment ago, which is that, and my takeaway from it was that in our driving of relationships across businesses and sectors, you still have this central driving force of culture. And as long as everybody is coming back to a concerted culture, then that will continue to be the glue that brings solutions together at the end of the day. And it's with that understanding that businesses, whether they're in the financial services industry, whether they're in the logistics industry, whether in the education sector, they can better understand what exactly their client needs, because they better understand culture and how they operate as a microcosm or a driver within that culture as well. And so that was just a profound sub-theme that I took away from what you were mentioning, Camilla. And while we're discussing some of your research, the two American financial plans, I want to think out to the next 50 years. And how do we make sure that we're not exacerbating the racial income gap, and what must happen to address some of these concerns that have been found during your research and to American financial plans?
Thank you, Brad. And that was one of actually the impetus for this paper was working with a Caucasian CEO of an RIA and how they can better serve communities of color. And we talked about the cultural aspects of planning. One of the things, it really started with tithing, actually, is how do I help a family? They want to save money for retirement, but they're tithing, Camila. And I said, well, I'll share, my family is from Augusta, Georgia, right? Baptist church. And I said to him, you don't want to touch tithing, right? I think you want to take a step back and have a conversation about what that means to them and their household and their value system. So I think it's a great connection as to why I'm even here today talking about this white paper. In terms of ways we can help close the racial wealth gap, one of the biggest things, and I think it's going back first to see what are the systemic barriers to why the racial wealth gap exists. There's preconceived notions that it's due to spending or it's due to lack of education, but it really isn't, right? You think back of, we went back to the Homestead Act and the millions of acres of property that were given to white households, and they were continuously passed on from one generation to another. And we know that land is a huge generator of wealth. So for those of you who, I'm sure you'll have the ability to read this paper, but I think it's really important to see the historical context. But in our paper, we did look at the things that, as financial planners, things that we can control, right? So one of them, of course, is education. So we encourage our clients and our households to go to, nonprofit universities or public universities because they tend to have better educational outcomes and lower student loan debt. We encourage individuals to work with a financial planner. And more importantly, it's, things like, how do you help someone with the asset allocation in their retirement plan? We notice that Black households have an overdependence on things like cash life insurance or cash value life insurance versus investing in equities and things that have higher expected returns. We also looked at things like housing, right? So to your point, and we did this with our clients, the Federal Reserve did a study of 6.4 million applications. And they found that there was more than likely, the rejection rate was double for qualified Black applicants than white applicants. So part of our process that we do go through is how do you help these Black households navigate mortgage underwriting? How do you help them get the best interest rate? Because it's a considerable, meaningful generator of long-term wealth. So those are the things that we can focus on is how do we help them understand the contributing factors to build wealth? And I think the last thing I'll mention is earnings wealth gap. And we do talk about, there's specific majors that do better than others, right? Particularly STEM. STEM has higher outcomes and earnings has a direct correlation to wealth. So one of the things that we want to focus on as planners, yes, we're here to help you with your investment allocation, but we're there to help you with family household wealth and how can we articulate that and support that in the planning process.
Understood. And excellent research that you've been able to do. Ray, I also got to know, what you advise for companies and how they can go from capital impact commitments to tracking metrics of that impact, those very dollars that they put in press releases, until the ethos and the execution is actionably embedded into the corporate culture.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I just want to go back one second and double click on what Camilla said around things that we control and education being one of them. And I know everyone on this call and probably everyone that's tuning in is all about action. Like, what are the things that we control? And one of the things that we have learned over the last 13 years of doing this work of financial education and under-resourced communities across the country is that we have to move beyond education. And we really need to start thinking about access, data, impact, and research. And I believe that over the next 5 to 10 years, we have an opportunity to make sure that every student in this country has access to a savings account. The Federal Reserve came out in 2015, the Federal Reserve, the OCC, the CFPB, all the governing agencies of our financial institutions, of our banks, and said, hey, a youth savings account is a best practice. And if we're going to make a dent in the study that Lisa shared around the racial wealth gap for Black and Latinx families, I mean, this trend has persisted since the 1970s. So my entire lifetime, one thing that we can do is we can ensure that students have a savings account. We can start this conversation earlier. It's not going to solve everything, but I think it'll be a step in the right direction. And to get to your question, I think one company that has done a really good job of this is Mass Mutual and the Mass Mutual Foundation. So Dennis Duquette runs their foundation, and they have made a 10-year, $54 million commitment to providing financial education to every middle school in the United States. And that program is reaching 6,000 middle schools. We've had 2 million students go through that curriculum, and then they've embedded research underneath it. And we just finished a 3-year efficacy study looking at the impact of providing a technology solution to students and teachers at scale. And the results were really compelling, where it said, this is effective for students regardless of age, race, gender, and parent education level. But it's not enough. It's not enough. Like, we have to really think about access to financial advisors like Camilla, and how people really build their wealth over time and do that responsibly.
Certainly. As we're getting some of the audience questions that are coming in, I see that we are at 1:45 p.m. Eastern time, and we do have an allotted amount of time for some of those audience questions. My final question actually was kind of in lockstep with what one of our audience questions was that came in. So I do want to get to this one. And the question is, how do we dispel the myth that many Black families have towards financial advisement, that it's not within their grasp and that they can't afford it or wouldn't benefit from it? And that kind of runs in lockstep with the question that I had specifically around, breaking down some of the perceptions that families may have towards financial institutions. We had kind of gotten into this comment before, and Lisa, I believe that you had brought that up within the conversation.
Yeah, I was anxious to add one of the things that I think, I appreciate. We should focus on where we can have an impact. And one of the ways that we can have an impact is in demystifying everything that we're talking about. And the counsel I would give to financial planners and people in the space is the same counsel I give to my colleagues every day. Speak in everyday language. Like, when you're talking in your industry, you know what you're saying, and it resonates with you. But for the average person, like, how do you articulate and how do you create a narrative that people understand? So I'm in the comms business, so that's my job, is to translate. And so I think so much of that is really, really important, because you hear these conversations, and think about that last data point I had about the psychological impact it has on people, their discomfort with money. And then when you hear people saying things and you're like, oh, I know this is not for me. And then you kind of want to break it down and say, like, straight up, this is all it is. Make your money, put your money someplace where you can spend it and you can save it, and then have a plan for the future. Like, that's it. But then when we talk about it, it's the same thing about these jobs, like, well, I can't even visualize myself doing what Camilla does. Camilla helps people make money. And then she shows them how to save their money and to spend their money. You can do that. You can do that. And you can work, and we talked a lot about representation, how it feels when you come into an institution. So, it's kind of basic, like our parents told us this, open your mouth and speak. Like, it's real basic. It is not that hard. Open your mouth and say, hi, can I help you? And assume positive intent, and assume, Camilla said, people are like, they ask the question, why are you here? Assume I'm here for a reason. And work with me straight from that point. So a lot of it is demystify, use language that people can recognize. And then for me, we talked about starting this young. If I make it a point not to talk about clients, but one of our clients is where I have banked, and my card says member since 1972, because the first thing my parents did was give us bank accounts. Now, I can promise you over a period of time, there's about 3 cents in 1 or 2 of them. But kept it open and there was something in there. And so it's really literally just making it that small of a thing, but have an account, learn how to save, demystify how much money you have to have. The people that Camilla deals with, they're less than the 1%. So for the rest of us, you can still save your money and you can still earn your money and you can still pass down and share your money.
Absolutely. I would love to add on to that real quick and then get thoughts from Camilla and Ray as well on that same question, because I think it also comes back to, as someone who has worked in the financial services and fintech industry, are you an effective communicator, or are you making it harder for your end consumers to access what they are coming to you for? And it's as simple as that. And as someone who's come from a marketing and communications background prior to getting into the broadcast services sector, it actually has that same overlap. Am I disseminating information that is understandable? And if it is not understandable, what do I need to do to change so that I know that the person that I'm speaking to, either on camera or through a ad campaign that's running, is getting the message and understanding and feeling like they are empowered to take those next steps as well. And you spoke a lot about this as well, Camilla, and that's what your role has been for so many years also. So I'd love to get some of your thoughts as well on that same question that Lisa was just answering a moment ago.
One thing I'll share is my undergraduate degree is also in communications, ironically. And that's one thing I tell people. When I started working at Vanguard right out of college, I was a communications major, right? And I'll share, I didn't even know what a mutual fund really was. Right? I joined an organization, I read about it, and I knew what stocks and bonds were, but I really took my Series 6 and my 63 and worked my way up throughout the organization. And so I tell people that intentionally is that if you would have talked to 18-year-old Camilla and said she would be a financial planner and she would have FINRA licenses and designations, she would not have believed you, right? But really it's all about, willingness to learn, wanting to help your community and wanting to really build wealth. And that's one thing I'll share is that even some of my clients, they are high net worth earners, but they're first generation high net worth earners, many that work at these tech firms. And one of the issues they even ask is, am I ready for a financial advisor? And one of the things we talk about, it's not about a certain asset amount or what you do for a living, it's what are your goals? And do you have the time, willingness, and ability to help you reach them? And if you don't, that's when you engage a financial advisor or a financial planner. And so that's part of my goal, is to help educate them and help teach them. I think the communications background has helped, because one thing you learn is like, what are the adult learning styles? How do I communicate something to you visually or verbally, or are you a conceptual learner? And how do I break that down for you? And it's really understanding, the education and basis of your client's knowledge and building upon that. So that's one of the things that I think many people don't understand, is that we have this, emerging group of really high earning individuals who want to learn more about financial planning and wealth management. They want to be the developers of wealth for their family. And how do we as an industry or profession provide them the tools and access to be able to do that for their families?
Certainly. And Ray, just
Brad,
briefly, want to bring you into. Yeah, certainly.
But it is for that group, and it's also for 18-year-old Camilla, who is not going to do that. But it's also for 17-year-old Lisa. It's also for 30-year-old Brianna, who just started realizing, oh, I've got a little money and I should probably start saving this. And so it is that wealth. Everybody's definition of wealth varies. So what's wealthy to you may be different than what's wealthy for me, but everybody has wealth and everyone has contribution and everyone has something that they can save and they can try to invest.
Yeah, certainly. On those levels of education, and Ray, I imagine that you have a ton of insight to add on to that as well, just very briefly here, because on the education front, as Lisa was mentioning, it also starts at a younger age. And so how do you make it approachable in K through 12, in a curriculum there, and then make sure it matriculates into college education as well along the way? And I also do want to get to one more question afterwards, so I'll ask you to be brief.
So I'll just add, if we think about the people that have influenced us in our lives, it's our parents, it could be a professor, it could be a coach, it could be a teacher, and there's a theme there around education. And so education, if delivered in the right way, will build trust, and that will build loyalty over time. So we have to get the education piece right. It needs to be relevant, it needs to be timely, and it needs to be able to really resonate with a diverse set of learners.
Certainly. Another question that we got from our audience, Lisa made a great point about having more representation of people in color in the financial sector. How does that happen when those who have the authority to hire refuse to do so?
Well, for those who refuse to do so, they're going to get real comfortable soon. So that's all I can say about that. You know, this is the thing about representation. The sooner we as business leaders understand that these issues are not social issues. These are financial issues. These are smart business issues. We have clients every day who are looking at the diversity of my teams and saying, they're all men, or they're all white, or they're all from private schools. And so I think that the market is increasingly mandating that our organizations, our workplaces, our financial institutions are representative. And I think we also have an administration now that is very much focused on that representation, and by, you know, as Malcolm says, you know, by any means necessary, it's going to have to change. So either you change on your own or you will be forced.
And Camilla, it also kind of dovetails back to your own background and what you were saying, and how you were able to be the first woman of color, the first Black woman to be able to hold positions that you have right now. And that representation matters because it also allows for the door to be open for other people to make their way in, and for us to, again, have this culture centricity that drives our consumer relations as well at the end of the day too.
Yeah, one thing I heard is that millennials, they don't look at diversity, they look at the absence of it. So you think about how they were raised in a very multicultural, you know, think about TV from my age. I don't want to age myself from this webinar, but versus what you see now, right? You see diverse television shows, you know, interracial relationships with, you know, on main networks. That wasn't there 40 years ago. So they're used to seeing diversity. And so if you're an organization that is reluctant to embrace you know, equal representation of all communities of color, it's going to affect you. It's going to affect the bottom line, to Lisa's point.
And you won't be able to attract the talent, because this millennial talent is saying very clearly, it's clear this is a workers' environment. And so, and workers are increasingly saying, if I don't like the way your company looks, if I don't like the way your board looks, if I don't like the way your leadership looks, and I don't like what you're saying on issues that I care about, I'm not going to come work for you. But I do like what they're saying, and oh, look, that's your competitor, and I'm going over there and I'm taking my talent with me.
You know, and one of the other major questions that's come up from our audience members, and perhaps this will be our final question before we get to closing remarks, is the Asian American experience as well. We have all seen the hashtags earlier this year, hashtag Stop AAPI Hate. And as this relates to this responses that we've seen from companies and the commitments that they've made as well to address racism in totality, you know, how has the financial services sector been thinking about breaking down financial stereotypes broadly that perpetuate systemic inequalities and assumptions of the Asian population, the Black American population, the indigenous population as well, that are looking for access right now?
I can take a stab at that. When we talk about emerging majorities, we're talking about organizations or people who have been underrepresented, and that is Black, that is Latinx, and that is the AAPI community. It's women. It's people sometimes in rural areas. It's people, so there's a whole host of, there's LGBTQ community. So those are the groups that have not been fully represented at the table, but who are increasingly making up our majority, our emerging majority. And so when I am a belief that when one boat, when one boat rises, all tides do. And so the more we do for each other, we lift everyone up. And I think it is incumbent upon all of us, when we do have a seat at the table, to represent everybody who doesn't. I mean, that very much happens. Like, you get that seat and you get like this, you've got to keep that seat, invite other people in, and recognize that while I may be an African-American CEO, I represent everybody in my company, but I have a special responsibility to those whose voices have not been heard, and that is beyond African-American, that is beyond Latinx. It is all of those groups that I talked about. But to be clear, when it comes to financial services industry, it is most acute when it comes to in terms of discrimination against African Americans.
Certainly. I want to be a good steward of our time here and make sure that I am obedient to the 2 p.m. hour that we have just struck here, East Coast time. And I just want to thank everybody who is on this great panel, not just for engaging, but bringing the most candid the insights, the research, and the amazing solutions as well that we will continue to discuss and also enact in the very near future as well. And Lisa, I just want to thank you and the team at Edelman once again for putting this on, and I'll toss things back over to you for closing remarks.
I mean, one, I end where I usually try to begin, and that is with gratitude. So thank you, Brad, for a masterful moderation of a conversation. Camilla, thank you for showing that if you can see it, you can be it. And for all the work that you're not only doing now, but that what you're going to do. Ray Anasepi told me to say nice things about you, and even if she hadn't, I would say that I learned a lot from your perspective. And I guess the key takeaways for me are demystify, emerging majorities, start young, and everyone has something to give and everyone has something to gain. And that would be my close.